everyone, Miss Carrie here from Miss Carrie's Creations. Today we're going to be creating 3 Christmas cards with the Christmas tree stamp and thin cuts and some wedding paper that's called Love Story. This comes in 3 shades, mink and toffee and black, and we're going to be using the toffee shade today. Along with the papers, we are using this fun stamp set. It's called Christmas Trees. It does have some matching thin cuts and all of those fun little tree images. All right, let's go ahead and get started with the first card. I've already cut out all of my papers and cardstock pieces that I'm going to need. I've cut out a frame for our shaker. This was cut from the square stitched thin cut dies. And then I also cut a background sheet from that Love Story paper using the rectangle dies. And that's how we got all of the stitching. If you take a look at this die, you can see the center there is the cut that I'll be using for the front of my card. I also have a package of the shaker window foam and acetate in the square shape to make our little shaker element. And I have this Merry Christmas trimmings stamp set that I'll be using for the sentiment. The first thing I'm going to do is heat emboss this sentiment. So I need to prep my square with an anti-static pouch, and then I'm going to stamp the sentiment in the center of that white square using Versamark ink. I'm going to be creating a resist with Distress Oxide inks, so I'm going to be using white embossing powder. Now, after I have sprinkled the embossing powder onto the card, I'm going to go ahead and tap off the excess. And if you take a look at the powder, you can see that it is loose and it has a matte finish. But when I bring in my heat tool and I start to heat up that embossing powder, you're going to see that it slowly becomes shiny. Now, I know it's very difficult to see here with white on white, but I'm going to try to turn it to the light. And you can see that it's raised up off the card just a little bit and it has a shinier finish. All right, let's go ahead and bring in our Distress Oxide inks and start adding that blue background to our shaker sentiment. So I'm going to go ahead and start out by using a blending brush to add some chipped sapphire ink to this white daisy cardstock. Now you might have noticed that I have a little post-it note there that I'm using to help me hold down that white daisy cardstock. Not only is it helping me hold it in place, but it's also keeping the ink off my fingers and it's preventing my fingers from touching the inked surface. My fingers often have lotion or oil on them, and that can actually react with the Distress Oxide inks, which causes little fingerprints on your design. So I have discovered that it works best to use either a post-it note or a scrap piece of paper to help me hold my cardstock while I'm applying the ink over my images. To deepen the blue and add to the distress look of the card, I have brought in some ground espresso ink, and I'm just adding the ink to the edges of the card, creating almost a vignette. And then I'm going to come back in with the chipped sapphire and blend the 2 colors together and really give it a nice deep blue color. Now you might have noticed that the sentiment is resisting the ink. The embossing powder is preventing the ink from covering up any of that sentiment. To bring out the sentiment even more, I've just grabbed a dry paper towel and I'm going to rub it across the sentiment and remove all of the excess ink. And now you're just going to see that sentiment just really begin to pop against that chipped sapphire ink. Now, because this is a Christmas card, I'm also going to add a little bit of sparkle. This is a trick Chelsea taught us in the 31 Days of Christmas Cards event, and her card turned out gorgeous. Off to the side, I have mixed some diamond stickles with some water, and I am splattering it onto the background with a paintbrush. This is going to react with the ink and give us a beautiful sparkly background for our shaker element. Oh, and by the way, you can still join that 31 Days of Christmas Cards event through the end of November and get a chance to see Chelsea's card. Again, super gorgeous card. You don't want to miss it. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at this up close so you can see all of the sparkle. Now, as this dries, it is going to react with that ink and create that oxidized look. All right, let's go ahead and stamp our tree image for the card. So I'm going to be masking this tree image so that I can get 3 different colors on one single image. The first thing I'm going to do is place my stamp onto a stamping platform, and then I'm going to be placing a super sticky Post-it note down in the upper corner of that stamping platform, and I'm going to stamp an image of the tree onto that Post-it note. Now we're going to create our mask. So we're going to cut apart this Post-it note and create kind of a little puzzle with the 3 images. Each one of these images is going to be stamped in a different color. Once I have cut apart my little masking puzzle, I'm going to go ahead and put it back together over the top of that white cardstock. Since I already have avocado ink on my tree image, I'm going to start with the tree portion of the stamp. I'm going to use my tweezers to remove that portion of the mask little puzzle piece there. And then I'm going to ink up my tree image and remove my scissors before I stamp the little tree in avocado ink. Now I'm going to clean my stamp. I'm going to place that little tree puzzle piece back down in the center, remove the portion of the puzzle that is the trunk, and then I'm going to stamp the trunk of the tree in espresso ink. Once again, I'm going to clean my stamp. I'm going to replace that little trunk puzzle piece, and we're going to repeat the process with the heart. I'm going to remove that little mask puzzle piece, ink up my heart image with scarlet ink, and stamp the image. Now, the nice part about having a stamping platform is that if the image doesn't turn out really great the first time, you can go ahead and re-ink the image and stamp it one more time. All right, now the fun part. We're going to go ahead and remove this mask and take a look at our stamped image. Wasn't that easy? And I can save all of these parts and pieces with my stamp set and use it the next time I make a Christmas tree. So off camera, I went ahead and used the thin cut dies to cut out the Christmas tree. Take a look. Isn't it cute? I love this tree. All right, now we're going to take all of these elements we created and put together our card. So I've already placed a piece of ribbon on that patterned paper, and I'm adhering it down onto the espresso cardstock. Now we're going to go ahead and build our little shaker element. So I've gone ahead and grabbed a piece of acetate from the package. There is a piece of film on one of the sides, so I'm just going to use a little rubber eraser to help me remove it. I'm going to use a little bit of liquid adhesive to help me glue the acetate down onto that craft colored frame. While this dries, I am going to get my foam square frame ready to adhere onto the acetate. The first thing I'm going to do is remove the backing from the square frame that I'm going to be using. And then I'm going to use a piercing tool to go around that square frame. Sometimes a few of those little squares attach to the frame, so I always like to use this little piercing tool around the frame just in case, because it's better to do it before than after. Now we're going to place our craft frame right on top of that foam frame, lining them both up so they're nice and centered. And then we're going to carefully peel away that craft colored frame, and you'll see that the foam frame comes right off the backing sheet with it. Wasn't that easy? Now, because I already have the backing off the foam frame, I find that it's easier to add the sequins to the back of the shaker. If I try to pour it into the acetate, I always end up with little shaker elements on the sticky portion of the foam, and then I end up all frustrated and I end up spilling sequins all over the place. So for me, it's a lot easier just to pour all of these sequins right there on the backing, and then I will place the foam frame over the top. All right, now we have our fun little shaker element. I think this is super cute. How about you? Okay, so now we're just going to go ahead and glue this down onto the card base. After that's been adhered into place, I'm going to grab a couple of those foam squares, place them on the back of the tree, and adhere it down onto the lower right side of the shaker frame. All right, now our first card is complete. This card had quite a few more techniques involved to create it, which is why I did it first. The next two cards are super easy. Let's go ahead and get started. For the second card, I used those rectangle frames once again to create the stitching around this love story patterned paper. I also have a piece of craft paper for my card base. I've also cut 2 trees from espresso cardstock using those Christmas trees thin cut dies. I also have this Merry Sentiment cut from white, espresso, and vellum, and then I have some scraps of espresso cardstock for my stamped images. Once again, we are going to heat emboss our stamped images. So I'm going to prep my espresso cardstock, and then I am going to use one of the tree images with Versamark ink to stamp an image on that larger piece of espresso cardstock. Once again, I am going to use white embossing powder, and I'm going to sprinkle that on the tree image. Before I pull out my heat tool, I'm going to go ahead and stamp the sentiment on that little strip of espresso cardstock using Versamark ink, and then I will also sprinkle it with white embossing powder. If you're new to heat embossing, here's a little tip. Always apply the heat from the back. If you apply the heat from the front, there's a chance that the air could disturb some of that embossing powder. So you always want to apply your heat from the back side and continuously move your heat tool while you melt that embossing powder. While I have my all-purpose mat out, I'm going to apply a little bit of Distress Oxide ink around the edges of the craft cardstock just to add a little bit of an aged, distressed look. Now we're going to assemble the card. So the piece of pattern paper is going to be placed down in the center of the craft cardstock. And then I'm going to use some of this art glitter glue to adhere all 3 layers of that Merry Sentiment together. The die cut is going to be placed onto the card using some pop dots or foam dots. This is also going to allow me to tuck those little trees behind it. That Merry Sentiment is also going to act like my grounding strip. I like to tell people it's a lot like decorating a mantle. You need a place to set all of your elements upon, kind of like a fireplace mantle. When you're decorating a card, you don't want your elements floating all over the place. You need some sort of grounding strip to place all of those items upon. And that's exactly what that little Merry Sentiment is doing. It's acting just like a fireplace mantle, a place where I can rest my trees. Alright, so after layering the trees onto the card, I decided that I wanted to add a couple of snowflakes. So I've grabbed my little pickup tool here, and I'm using it to help me figure out where I want the snowflakes to go. Once I've decided where I want them to be placed, I'm just going to grab my art glitter glue, use that pickup tool to pick up those little snowflake sequins, and I'll adhere everything down onto the card. The last little element is an acrylic heart, and I'm going to add this to the card with a glue dot. I love that these shapes are so much thinner than they used to be. It makes them perfect for card making. All right, the second card is complete. Like I said, super simple and super easy. Let's go ahead and make our third card. For this card, I have a piece of espresso cardstock that's been cut a little bit smaller than the card base, a piece of craft paper that was cut with those rectangle dies, and then a piece of the love story paper. This is the back side of the paper we used earlier. And then we also have a little joy die that was cut with this joy thin cut from espresso cardstock. Once again, we are going to be doing some heat embossing. This time I'm going to be stamping on the background, and I don't want to stamp past the stitching. So I've just grabbed some pieces of Post-it tape, and I'm just going to mask off the edges of the card so that none of my stamped images go past those stitched lines. Once again, I'm going to prep my surface with my anti-static pouch. This prevents any excess powder from sticking where I don't want it to. I'm going to be random stamping a tree image, and I could use Versamark ink, but I found with random stamping, it's easier for me to use an ink that I can see, which is why I'm choosing to use the white pigment ink instead. When you randomly stamp images, there are 3 things to keep in mind. First of all, always stamp your images off the edge. Secondly, rotate your stamps occasionally. And third, create a triangle with your stamped images as you stamp them onto your background. All right, so I'm going to pause my stamping here for a minute, and I'm going to sprinkle these images with embossing powder. Craft paper soaks up ink pretty quickly, so I want to make sure I get this powder down on the paper before I continue my stamping. As I stamp the rest of these images, I'm being super careful that I don't disturb any of the embossing powder that I've already laid down. Once I'm done stamping, I can go ahead and sprinkle the rest of the images with the embossing powder, and then I'm going to go ahead and heat set this background. Now, before I do that, I need to make sure that I remove that foam pad that I have underneath, because if I apply any heat to it, it's going to end up melting and making a mess. Once the embossing powder has melted, I can go ahead and remove that Post-it tape mask, and then I'm just going to use a dry paper towel to remove any of the excess powder from the anti-static pouch and start assembling the card. I've gone ahead and adhered down the espresso cardstock, and then I'm going to place down that embossed craft paper. Because of craft paper's texture, it's best to use liquid adhesive when you are adhering it down onto your project. I found that a tape runner doesn't always work with the craft paper. I'm going to go ahead and set a stamping block on top of all of these layers and set them aside to dry. Across the top of this diagonal pattern strip, I'm going to add another piece of this love story paper. I'm going to go ahead and trim it just a little bit larger than the 2 inches, and then I'm going to wrap it with some gold embellishing thread. I did add a little strip of that tape runner adhesive on the back of the pattern paper to help me hold the embellishing thread in place while I wrapped it around the top of this paper strip. I'm going to be stamping a sentiment that says wishing you, but my stamp says wishing you a. So I'm going to need to create a little bit of a mask to prevent the A from stamping on my pattern paper. Now, if I weren't so clumsy, I could have just left off the mask and tried to make sure that I didn't get any ink on the A. But it always seems that I end up with ink on part of the stamp where I don't want it to be, except for this time, of course. And I like to have that mask in place as just a little safety measure in case I happen to get ink on the A. All right, so my pattern paper strip is going to go over on the left side, and under the sentiment, I'm going to be placing that joy die cut. Now, I just wanted to place all of this down so that I could figure out where to cut my chevron. And now that I know where to cut it, I can go ahead and trim that patterned paper. Off camera, I have adhered that pattern paper strip onto the card, and I've cut a couple more of those joy die cuts. I realized that I wanted a little bit of dimension on this card, but it was going to be a little difficult to add foam tape to the word joy. So I decided instead that I was going to layer multiple die cuts together and create almost the look of chipboard with those layers of cardstock. This is a great solution when you want to add dimension to a card and you're unable to use foam tape. All right, so I've gone ahead and glued all 5 layers of the word joy together, and now I've added a little bit of dimension to the card. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at all 3 cards we completed today. Here are the 3 cards that I showed you how to make today using those Christmas trees stamps and thin cuts. I showed you how to use 3 of the tree images today, but you could use any of the images to create these cards. On this first card, I showed you how to create a mask so that you could create a multicolored tree image. On this card, we created this fun little shaker with some heat embossing and Distress Oxide. Off camera, you can see that I added that little button. I also added a wooden heart and some stitching on the ribbon. I love how all of the elements came together on this little shaker card. On the Joy card, I showed you how to use that stamped image to create a randomly stamped background, and I showed you how to heat emboss on craft cardstock. Off camera, I used a pen to create a little bit of doodling around the banner, and I added a little wooden heart icon. This card was really simple to make. This third card came together beautifully on that wedding-themed paper. 2 of the trees are created with the dies, and then we heat embossed the third tree. Off camera, I did add a few doodles with a white gel pen. I actually love the way all of this came together, and I think it's one of my favorite cards. But I would love to know which of these cards is your favorite. I want to thank you for joining me today. I hope that this video gave you a few ideas for using the Christmas tree stamp and that you learned a few heat embossing tips along the way. Now don't forget, the 31 Days of Christmas Cards event has reopened. When you join, you have access to 31 Christmas card making videos and a guidebook with all of the instructions created by the creative design team. Registration is closing soon, and we would love for you to join us. If you would like to view more of my card making tutorials, you can click on the playlist above. While you're at it, go ahead and hit the subscribe button so that you don't miss any future tutorials. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I can't wait to see what you create.